Deep within the human psyche, beyond conscious perception, lies an invisible yet colossal force. It continues its influence even when physical barriers like vast oceans separate people, even when the earth has already claimed the body, or when decades of silence have severed all visible threads of connection. Its presence is not limited to ephemeral memories. It is woven into the very fabric, the very architecture of a person's inner world. The great thinker Carl Gustav Jung once warned of the power of this force, which he called the mother complex, a phenomenon simultaneously terrifying in its depth and absolutely fundamental in the formation of personality. However, this is not about a specific woman of flesh and blood, but about an invisible internal image, about the indelible emotional imprint she left on the soul. This unseen yet pervasive force subtly but powerfully shapes a person's life choices, defines their inner voice, influences the nature of their relationships, and even the profound story they tell themselves about their own existence. This is what Jung termed the shadow mother. It is not the nurturing and idealized face typically presented to the outside world, but rather a psychic residue composed of unmet needs, unspoken expectations, and the generational pain passed down through time. And here lies one of the most painful yet unavoidable truths. Complete healing will remain elusive until one dares to confront this internal entity face to face. This is not an encounter with the external, tangible mother, but with the one who continues to live and act deep within. For many, such an immersion into their own depths is a territory simultaneously sacred and terrifying, evoking both reverence and primal fear. Jung, a visionary of the human soul, left us an important reminder. Nothing has a stronger psychological influence on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. This profound principle reveals how vitally important it is to know and reconcile with this inner figure, for its influence extends far beyond one life, shaping destinies and generations. When an individual takes on the burden of maternal pain, her secret shame, her deep silence, and her unspoken grief, they inevitably become trapped in an existence that is not rightfully theirs. Such a person begins to function merely as an echo of the mother's essence, her loyal protector, or a direct continuation, which gradually leads to the fading of their own inner light and the soul's vital energy. The concept presented here is not a path of condemnation or blame. On the contrary, it is a sincere call for individuals to reclaim their authentic selves, to restore those aspects of themselves that were never properly nurtured or acknowledged. It is an invitation to honor the sorrow that their inner child was never allowed to experience, and finally, to free themselves from a burden that was never meant for them. Within this exploration, there is no place for pointing fingers. Instead, it sheds light on the most hidden corners of the human psyche. For true liberation is achieved not through resentment or rejection of the mother, but through conscious confrontation and transformation of the mother image imprinted within the individual. This narrative will delve deep into the hidden recesses of the human psyche, beyond emotional pain, beyond the ego, into the complex, alchemical process of death and subsequent rebirth that is initiated the moment an individual finally decides to free themselves from this burden. The reader will be able to understand why their healing process may have stalled, how the maternal wound has shaped their personality, and how the fundamental teachings of Carl Gustav Jung offer a path not just to surviving psychological trauma, but to achieving genuine inner sovereignty. While the truth may seem simple, the path to it is often thorny and full of obstacles. Individuals are allowed to break free from the shackles of infantile dependence, shed the burden of others' sorrows and expectations, re-evaluate established narratives, and form their own story. This process begins with a truly terrifying but necessary act of courage, a direct confrontation with the image of the mother rooted in the depths of one's own consciousness. It is with this confrontation that one must begin. The first step is understanding the significance of the mother archetype in the collective unconscious. In Jungian psychology, the image of the mother extends beyond merely the biological parent. She occupies a fundamental, primordial position in the unseen structures of the collective unconscious, representing an eternal, transpersonal image that permeates all layers of human experience and is deeply imprinted in the very matrix of the human psyche. For Jung, the mother is primarily an archetype, an all-encompassing psychic pattern inherited through generations rather than created by individual consciousness. She manifests with remarkable consistency in dreams, myths, and interpersonal relationships. Her nature is not limited to purely personal experience. It possesses an archetypal eternity. The mother archetype has a dual, sometimes contradictory nature. She appears as a generous giver of being and a ruthless devourer of existence, capable of both life-giving nourishment and suffocating control. This phenomenon Jung termed the paradox of the Great Mother. This image is ancient, predating civilization itself, and embodies both a sense of absolute security and a hidden threat, symbolizing creative power and destructive force, unconditional comfort, and an all-consuming abyss. This archetype is not limited to the specific historical or personal identity of an individual's biological mother. It exists on a deeper, subconscious level. Its manifestations can be found in sacred religious icons, in powerful symbols of nature, in ancient mythological traditions, and even in the very image of planet Earth. Thus, the mother is simultaneously one who nourishes and one who threatens to engulf. For those burdened with unhealed wounds inherited from maternal figures, the mother archetype is inextricably intertwined with personal trauma. Carl Gustav Jung, the eminent Swiss psychiatrist, warned that when an individual confuses the image of their personal mother with the archetypal essence, they inevitably enter a labyrinth of the psyche where childhood suffering repeatedly manifests in adult relationships. Such individuals may passionately desire care and affection, yet experience terror at genuine intimacy. They seek approval, but are panically afraid of rejection. If the archetype remains split and unintegrated into consciousness, it inevitably gives rise to profound psychological distortions. In dreams, the mother image can appear either as a protective and gentle guardian, or, conversely, as a terrifying, devouring figure capable of engulfing. In ancient myths and legends, she embodies both Demeter and Kali, Mary and Medea. Jung, analyzing this duality, described it as the bipolar nature of the maternal archetype. It is the unity of good and evil, creator and destroyer, sacred and profane. When the human psyche stubbornly clings to only one facet of this archetype while suppressing the opposite, a profound fragmentation of personality occurs. For example, if a person tends to idealize their mother's image, they effectively deny her shadow aspects, her imperfections. Conversely, an attempt to demonize her means a complete rejection of her bright sides, her positive influence. In either of these extreme cases, the individual inevitably plunges into the mechanism of projection, unconsciously transferring their internal, unhealed wounds onto other people. Objects of such projection can be partners, mentors, superiors, spiritual teachers, essentially any figure who, in the individual's consciousness, carries symbolic maternal weight or authority. This is why so many people find themselves in a psychological deadlock, unable to move forward. True healing of the maternal wound can never be achieved on a superficial level. It requires deep inner work. Carl Gustav Jung emphasized the importance of overcoming purely personal grievances and urged a shift to the level of symbolic understanding. When a person perceives their mother exclusively through the purely individual perspective of childhood, focusing only on manifestations of her neglect, anger, or desire for control, they remain captive to their own egocentric narrative. However, when they begin to perceive her not merely as an individual, but as a vessel of ancient, powerful archetypal forces, when they realize that their suffering is not exclusively personal, but deeply rooted in universal, archetypal patterns, this opens the way to the deepest personal transformation. Jung wrote, "The greatest burden a child has to bear is the unlived life of the parents." And it is. Often through the figure of the mother that this unlived life is transmitted, manifesting in her unexpressed shame, suppressed silence, or deep sorrow. The formation of the mother complex occurs when the mother's emotional state is internalized by the child, not just as a separate memory, but as a kind of reflection of their own essence. Thus, a child who experienced emotional neglect may internalize the profound belief, "I am unworthy of love." At the same time, a child whose individuality was suppressed may internalize the thought, "I am not allowed to be independent, to be free." These internalized voices do not dissolve over time. On the contrary, they transform into the adult's inner dialogue, determining their perception of their own worth, body image, ability to express themselves, as well as their potential to love, feel belonging, and thrive. If these deeply rooted internal images remain unconscious, the individual often unconsciously seeks external resolution for their inner conflicts. This manifests in the pursuit of ideal romantic partners, in the tireless quest for career success, or even in a superficial fascination with spiritual practices. However, the root of the problem remains untouched. The inner wound continues to whisper obsessively, "You are still not good enough." Carl Gustav Jung asserted that the maternal wound is not merely a private tragedy of an individual, it is a vast, collective legacy. It is a kind of psychic pattern passed down from generation to generation, coded like emotional DNA. Mothers unconsciously transmit their own pain, their suppressed emotions, and their inner disconnectedness from the fundamental feminine principle to their offspring. And children, if they do not awaken, continue to carry this burden until one day someone, perhaps the very person reading these lines, finds the courage to face the image of the mother living within their psyche and declares, "This story ends with me." For Jung, true healing was not about trying to change the real physical mother. It consisted of a profound transformation of a person's relationship to their internal mother, to that complex network of associations, emotions, memories, and unconscious projections deeply rooted in their psyche. And this inner work is no trivial task. It holds sacred, almost mystical significance. For until one dares to confront this powerful internal image face to face, genuine, profound transformation remains unattainable. The concept of the mother, in the Jungian sense, extends far beyond individual experience. She also symbolizes the earth, personifies nature itself, and embodies the all-encompassing unconscious. Consequently, when a person is cut off from their inner mother, they simultaneously lose connection with the natural world, with their own body, with the deep source of intuition, and with the mysterious realm of the unknown. The result is a fear of darkness, an unwillingness to delve into the depths of one's feelings. A person begins to over-identify with the rational masculine principle, with aspects of control and order. In doing so, they inevitably lose the inexhaustible richness and fullness of their soul. The high cost of remaining indifferent to the archetypal mother is truly significant. It manifests in chronic anxiety, unresolved grief, dysfunctional relationships, creative stagnation, a sense of spiritual emptiness, and a constant feeling of alienation from oneself. Carl Jung viewed this phenomenon as a kind of psychological epidemic that afflicted a generation disconnected from their ancestral roots, from the deep feminine essence, from the great ancestress who gives life not only to physical bodies but also to souls. Thus, a threshold stands before the individual. Can they perceive their mother not just as a woman who caused them pain, but also as a portal to the ancient psychic forces that shaped her? Can the individual recognize the archetype operating through her and through themselves? Can they accept her imperfections and their own pain, without descending into either blame or excessive idealization? This is not about absolution or justification. It is a matter of true liberation. For until the image of the mother is perceived with absolute clarity, not just as a parent, but as a profound mirror, one will be condemned to an endless wandering in a closed loop. Healing will remain superficial, and awareness will not penetrate the hidden chambers of the unconscious. However, when one encounters the archetypal mother as she is, vast, mysterious, paradoxical, they stop seeking love in her shadow. They return to their origins. They finally begin to become themselves. Secondly, one should consider the phenomenon of the shadow mother and her role in psychological imprisonment. Within Jungian psychology, the shadow mother represents one of the most formidable and least understood inner forces of consciousness. Unlike the life-giving aspect of the maternal archetype, she is not the figure who provides protection, nurtures, or guides the way. On the contrary, her essence lies in engulfment. She emerges in dreams, ancient myths, and the quiet despair that sometimes overtakes adult life, being a force that clings, suffocates, manipulates, and impedes the free development of the soul. Carl Gustav Jung emphasized that this aspect, which seeks to engulf, is by no means a deviation or an anomaly. It represents an inherent, natural pole of the archetype itself. The Great Mother, by her dual nature, not only gives life but is also capable of consuming. She creates and she holds. And when this potentially destructive aspect remains unconscious, it transforms into a kind of psychic prison from which the ego is unable to escape. The manifestations of the Shadow Mother in a mythological context are diverse. She appears in the image of Demeter, stubbornly refusing to release her daughter Persephone, in the guise of dragons, tirelessly guarding sacred treasures, or in the figures of ancient goddesses devouring their own offspring. On a psychological level, her appearance is due to situations where maternal energy exceeds its natural, harmonious limits. This occurs when unconditional love transforms into total control, when caring protection turns into possessiveness, and genuine care merely masks deep dependence. In such critical moments, the child feels not protected and secure, but, on the contrary, engulfed and suppressed. However, because this destructive energy is clothed in familiar and seemingly benevolent maternal expressions, such as, "I just want what's best for you," the child is unable to recognize the true betrayal. As a result, their soul involuntarily folds inward, silently internalizing the deeply wounding belief, "My freedom is betrayal, my autonomy is treason." As Jung wrote, this force rarely penetrates consciousness overtly. Its grip is subtle, hidden beneath layers of conditioning and inherited guilt. In adulthood, it can manifest as paralyzing self-doubt, as a persistent inner critic tirelessly repeating the mother's voice. This hidden power can also express itself in an inability to feel safe independently or in a reflexive fear of disappointing others. Moreover, it sometimes leads to an unconscious attraction to romantic partners whose behavior is controlling, demeaning, or suffocating, thereby mirroring the emotional landscape of the deep maternal wound. The feeling of guilt, which invariably arises the moment a person tries to set a personal boundary, openly speak their truth, or distance themselves from dysfunctional relationships, is a direct consequence of this influence. The shadow mother at such moments whispers, "You are ungrateful, you are bad, you are selfish." Such a state represents psychological infantilization, a phenomenon Jung warned against, where a person's ego remains undeveloped and dependent. Despite physical maturity, the personality remains emotionally inextricably linked to the mother's expectations. Even if an individual moves to another city, changes their name, or begins to live overseas, they may still internally hear this voice that resonates in their consciousness before they utter a word, perform an action, or dare to truly live. The essence of the problem lies not in physical distance, which can be overcome, but in deep energetic entanglement. The ego continues to reside in a childlike state, constantly revolving in the mother's powerful gravitational field, terrified at the mere thought of stepping outside the established boundaries. Jung once observed that the human psyche often tends to prefer a familiar hell to unknown paradisiacal realms. In this context, the shadow mother appears precisely as such a hell, familiar, predictable, and offering false, deceptive comfort. Individuals do not remain in toxic dynamics out of a love for suffering, but because the pain itself maintains a certain psychic connection. Thus, suffering transforms into a kind of loyalty, and acts of self-betrayal paradoxically begin to be perceived as expressions of love. Until this deep pattern is recognized, people will tirelessly recreate the same conditions, sincerely believing that they are acting out of free will, although in reality they are merely reenacting the ancient myth of the engulfing mother. And what is the most powerful tool in the arsenal of such a maternal figure? Undoubtedly it is guilt. This is not about healthy guilt, which prompts the correction of moral errors, but about primordial guilt, an irrational inherited fear that separation is tantamount to death. Jung described this phenomenon as a psychic leash forged not by logic, but by a deeply rooted archetypal fear that whispers, "I am bad if I leave. I betray her if I become myself." This guilt has ancient roots. It speaks of the horror of exile, of the primal fear of losing the very foundation of existence. And under its weight, countless people remain paralyzed, sabotaging their own joy, suppressing truth, and capitulating to every impulse toward self-assertion. Remarkably, Carl Gustav Jung asserted that the archetype of the shadow mother is not merely a ruthless overseer. On the contrary, she also acts as a guardian at the threshold of the soul. Her image is akin to a dragon guarding treasures, or a monster with whom one must engage in confrontation to reclaim one's true self. The suffering she inflicts is by no means meaningless. It represents a kind of initiation rite. In ancient tales and myths, the hero must challenge her, not with the aim of complete annihilation, but for the purpose of reclaiming what she holds captive, the inalienable right to exist, to freely express feelings, to creative actualization, and to personal choice. Thus, the primary goal is not the destruction of this force, but its harmonious integration. To achieve this goal, Jung recommended the method of active imagination, which represents a conscious inner dialogue with the engulfing mother present within. Within this process, the individual visualizes her image. They engage in open conversation with her, expressing accumulated anger, deep grief, and a sense of betrayal. Both the abandoned inner child and this archetypal figure are allowed to speak. The individual confronts not an embodiment of evil, but a wounded archetypal force that has been distorted and deformed by many generations who have accumulated fear, shame, and unfulfilled desires. When this deep and sincere process is completed, a significant transformation occurs. The mother archetype loosens her powerful grip. The inner child begins to gain strength and rise. The psyche gradually remembers and realizes its true belonging, its sovereignty. This profound confrontation is nothing less than psychological death and subsequent rebirth. It symbolizes the departure of a dependent, infantile state and the birth of a sovereign, independent personality. Carl Jung, the renowned psychoanalyst, warned that this transitional stage is often accompanied by a sense of collapse, deep depression, overwhelming emptiness, and acute grief. However, this destruction is sacred. In essence, it is the dismantling of an inherited illusion that has long shaped one's perception of the world. The ego during this period may feel completely naked and vulnerable, but it is then that it becomes truly real for the first time. And only from this impenetrable darkness can light break through again, but it will not be borrowed radiance, but the person's own true soul fire. Thus it is important to clearly understand the so-called shadow mother is not an enemy. She serves as a threshold that must be crossed. She appears as a stern teacher, as a fierce embodiment of femininity whose existence demands that the individual awaken. And when one dares to face her, not to accuse or condemn, but to reclaim their true self, they open the door to genuine freedom. At this moment, life begins not as a child striving to please others, but as an adult capable of making choices independently. One rises not in defiant opposition to the mother, but in honor of what she herself could never complete. This is not just a process of personal healing, it is a large-scale generational liberation, a breaking of the psychic chain that bound generations, and a return to one's own soul. And for those who dare to walk this path, the reward is not ease of being, but wholeness, the rarest and most powerful gift available to humanity. Thirdly, one should note the phenomenon of the internal mother, an invisible but powerful dictator residing in the depths of the psyche. In the vast and complex architecture of the human unconscious, this psychic force reigns with striking silence and undisputed authority. She does not raise her voice, yet she governs. She does not strike, yet she steadily shapes the personality. The great psychologist Jung characterized this internal figure as the internalized maternal imago, a psychic echo of the maternal presence that becomes so deeply rooted in the unconscious that it often remains hidden from conscious perception throughout one's life. Even when the biological mother has left a person's life, be it through death, physical distance, or severed ties, the internal mother continues her existence not merely as a memory, but as a living, autonomous complex. It silently dictates how a person thinks, feels, makes decisions, and relates to the world. This internal figure transforms into the invisible monarch of the inner realm, whispering to the adult soul the truths that the child once absorbed without question or doubt. From the very first moment of existence, from the first breath, the mother, or the figure who fulfilled her role, appeared before the individual as the primary mirror through which they first grasped their own essence. Through her gaze, the intonation of her voice, the warmth of her embrace, or conversely, her aloofness, the individual learned how welcome they were in this world, or merely a tolerated presence. Jung posited that these early formative impressions don't merely settle in the brain's neural networks. They undergo profound mythologization within the soul itself, crystallizing into what he termed the maternal complex. This intricate psychic constellation ultimately transforms into the mother imago, a potent symbolic image imbued with immense emotional charge, deep meaning, and significant mythical weight, shaping many aspects of an individual's inner world. It is precisely here that the profound tragedy of human existence lies. The concept of the imago as an internal image of a significant other rarely reflects absolute reality. It is not the authentic image of the mother as she truly was, but rather her perception, formed through the lens of a psyche that was at that moment still immature, desperately striving for its survival and development. If this internal image of the mother was filled with care, sensitivity, and consistency in its manifestations, it transforms into an inexhaustible inner source of self-respect and a sense of security. However, if she appeared absent, rejecting, overly critical, or confusing, this image morphs into a silent saboteur, an invisible yet powerful force that subtly but relentlessly influences every relationship, every risk, every cherished dream. Her spectral voice can whisper destructive messages. You're too much. You're not good enough. Be quiet. Don't stand out. Stay unnoticed. Be safe. The renowned psychologist Jung repeatedly warned that when an individual mistakenly takes such an inner voice for their own self, they effectively become a prisoner of a phantom, confusing inherited programming with deep inner truth. This is where the inner saboteur originates. It's not merely common insecurity, but a deeply internalized criticism from the maternal figure who, in the past, withheld approval or used attachment as a means of manipulation. The inner mother can manifest in the psychic space as an echo of old disappointments, as a pervasive dictate to renounce oneself for the sake of pleasing others, or as a subtle panic that arises whenever we dare to step beyond inherited roles. Her voice becomes particularly clear during moments of personal growth and expanded consciousness, like an invisible hand inexorably pulling us back into the familiar yet suffocating prison of self-doubt. When this internal figure remains unconscious, Jung explained, it is inevitably projected outward onto lovers, mentors, supervisors, or friends. At this point, individuals cease to perceive others as they truly are, seeing them through the emotionally charged lens of their own unfulfilled maternal longings. These external figures are then expected to heal psychic wounds that were not inflicted by them. A disproportionate reaction arises, manifesting as excessive fear, insatiable need, or inappropriate anger. The individual begins to pursue the illusion of being chosen, receiving care, or gaining recognition. Unbeknownst to themselves, they attract partners who repeatedly reproduce the very emotional patterns they sought to escape. Thus, the negative, unintegrated maternal figure transforms into a distorting filter of reality perception, inevitably leading to confusion, profound disappointment, and an endless emotional repetition of the same scenarios. In its most harmful and destructive guise, the inner mother transforms into a veritable psychic vampire, not metaphorically, but in a literal energetic sense. This figure drains an individual's life energy, suppresses their natural instincts, and dims the flame of their creative potential. Such an impact manifests as perpetual fatigue, emotional apathy, a fear of making bold decisions, or an inability to act without an accompanying sense of guilt. The individual feels paralyzed, as if alive, yet utterly alienated from the fullness of being. Jung viewed this state as a form of possession, a kind of internal colonization, where the human soul loses its sovereignty and falls under the sway of a frozen image from a long-past memory. Paradoxically, individuals often maintain loyalty to this internal image of the mother, even if it caused pain, coldness, or cruelty. The psyche stubbornly clings to this imprint, nurturing the hope that by remaining sufficiently submissive, small, or suffering, the individual will eventually earn the desired attachment. However, as Jung asserted, this is nothing short of a tragic illusion. The inner mother is not subject to development. She is not a real entity. She represents a fixed psychic imprint. No matter how much effort is expended to gain her favor, all these attempts only plunge the personality deeper into a state of self-renunciation. For true healing, Jung insisted, a conscious separation must be initiated, not from the physical mother, but from that internal image which holds the soul captive. This process entails clearly naming the maternal complex and recognizing its true nature. It requires direct confrontation with the inner figure through active imagination, internal dialogue, dream analysis, and symbolic rituals. It also involves allowing repressed feelings to surface: anger, grief, a sense of betrayal, and deep longing. This path invites the individual to reclaim a voice that was once buried, to restore boundaries they feared to set, and to regain power once surrendered for survival. This separation is not an act of rebellion, it is a process of individuation, a sacred right to exist as a self, not merely a shadow. According to Jung, it is not enough merely to disarm the shadow. He believed that an individual must also restore the bright, positive aspect of the maternal archetype, the inner nurturer, the reliable protector, and the powerful creative force. This process is not a result of fantasy or denial of reality. On the contrary, it arises from the painstaking construction of entirely new internal relationships, founded not on deficit, but on genuine sovereignty. This is achieved through benevolent internal dialogue, conscious self-care rituals, connecting with mythological feminine symbols, and through practices of creativity and embodiment. Gradually, the individual begins to extend maternal care to themselves, and in doing so they reclaim those parts of their psyche that were once exiled in the name of survival. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In the context of the maternal complex, this inner darkness resides in the image of the inner mother, the silent dictator, the inherited voice, the deep ancestral wound. Until an individual dares to confront her, not with hatred, but with crystal clarity of understanding, they will remain captive to her influence. However, the moment this confrontation occurs, the individual enters something truly sacred. They begin to live no longer as a child seeking external permission or approval, but as a mature individual carrying both the fiery passion and the tender sensitivity of healed femininity. No longer is there an expectation of being chosen. Now, the choice is made by oneself. There is no longer a need to beg for love. Instead, the individual fills themselves with love to a state of complete wholeness. And it is in this act that the powerful spell of the inner mother inexorably begins to break, giving way to the awakening of a deeper self. The fourth point on the agenda was the topic of separation and the vital necessity of forming an independent ego. The great thinker Carl Jung asserted that one of the most sacred yet painful thresholds in human psychological life is the process of symbolic separation from the so-called maternal complex. This does not imply a complete rejection or abandonment of the real mother figure, but rather represents a decisive confrontation with a powerful archetypal gravitational field that constantly seeks to pull the ego back into a state of fusion, chronic dependence, and unconscious, deep loyalty. Without this fundamental separation, Jung warned, neither full individuation nor the formation of a genuine self, nor consequently the advent of a truly awakened and conscious life is possible. This process, in his view, is not merely an ordinary social phenomenon, but a profound psychic rite, a kind of internal mystery. At its core lies symbolic death and rebirth, which are often concealed behind the common adult struggles associated with setting personal boundaries, finding one's own identity, and defining life purpose. Meanwhile, maintaining a state of fusion with the maternal imago, whether due to deep guilt, unconscious fantasies, or a subconscious, unconscious fear, essentially means residing behind an invisible veil. In such a position, the individual does not act from genuine self-possession and inner autonomy, but rather conforms to inherited, prescribed roles. They may manifest as an eternally obedient child, or as a silent people-pleaser striving for approval, or as an inner orphan perpetually waiting to be finally seen and recognized. Carl Jung compared this critically important internal separation to a second birth. If the first birth granted physical liberation to the body, the second is intended to free the human soul from invisible bonds. It is precisely through this often agonizing and painful untangling of deeply entrenched psychic ties that the adult self begins its journey toward full development, not in a spirit of rebellion or denial of the past, but rather in a state of deep reverence and respect for what must naturally evolve and unfold. However, many souls resist this fundamental right to individuation. The process of separation, however necessary for full personal development, is often met with profound dread and internal resistance. Carl Gustav Jung, the eminent thinker, meticulously identified the powerful internal forces that keep an individual in a state of dependency. Among these is the primal fear of annihilation, the ancient terror of the infant who associates separation from the mother with inevitable demise. Next follows the guilt of betrayal, a deep psychic conviction that the pursuit of individuation is an act of ingratitude towards those who gave life and care. No less potent is the comfort of familiarity, where even a suffocating routine seems safer and preferable to unknown freedom. Finally, there are cultural frameworks that often elevate external loyalty and conformity above inner authenticity and selfhood. Jung emphasized that these are not merely ordinary neuroses specific to individuals. On the contrary, they are ancient, powerful archetypal currents, deeply rooted in the collective unconscious, universal forces that every person must confront if they genuinely aspire to achieve personal wholeness. When the separation process is actively avoided or suppressed, the consequences for the psyche are profound and destructive. In such cases, the child archetype unreservedly seizes the adult ego, subjecting it to its unconscious impulses. Beneath the polished surface of successful, high-functioning lives lies an invisible and unhealed inner child, still desperately pleading for permission to be real, to express its true feelings and desires. These individuals, despite their adult age and physical development, are unable to claim their inner authority and autonomy. They constantly hesitate before decisive actions, chronically postpone important decisions, suppress their genuine desires, and experience a panicked fear of failure, not because failure itself is catastrophic, but because it might provoke the judgment of that remaining mother in consciousness, whose invisible shadow continues to weigh upon their choices. In Jung's eyes, such a state was not a sign of mere immaturity. It was nothing less than deep psychic captivity. True separation is an authentic hero's journey, a deep descent into the unconscious forest. It implies confronting the formidable dragon of the maternal shadow, that force which, once a protector, turns into a jailer. The giver of blessings transforms into an insatiable devourer. This path is strewn with the bitterness of grief, profound confusion, fiery anger, and the poignant silence emanating from the depths of ancestral memory. To refuse this call is to condemn oneself to a life dictated not by the soul's summons, but merely by the urge to avoid. One who postpones this fateful journey risks plunging into existential despair, unconsciously repeating the unresolved drama of the maternal complex in every partner, every job, and every unfulfilled desire. For the authentic self to ascend, the ego must undergo its death. Carl Jung described this critical moment as a psychological crucifixion, the demise of the obedient child, the one who once sincerely believed that love could only be earned by suppressing their true nature. In place of this extinguished identity, a sovereign adult is born. They are not polished or ideal, but deeply grounded, freely breathing, and entirely ready to meet life as it is. This birth, like every act of creation, is accompanied by chaos and requires deep mourning, for a childhood that was never fully lived, for illusions now shattered, and for that profound longing that must now be confronted rather than perpetually fed. After the departure, however, a certain emptiness ensues, a silence so vast that it evokes profound awe. Carl Gustav Jung, the renowned thinker, described this void as a sacred space. It represents the vacuum that remains after the maternal voice ceases to entirely fill the individual's psyche. The true danger lies not in the emptiness itself, but if the individual is unable to fill it independently. If this inner space is not occupied by one's own values, sincere desires, and authentic inner voice, then the mother's shadow, it is asserted, will return with even greater force, becoming more elusive and all-consuming. It is for this reason that separation alone proves insufficient for full development. This act of detachment must inevitably be followed by creation, the formation of an entirely new internal structure, one that is neither borrowed nor inherited, but exclusively forged from deep self-awareness. When this process is complete, when the individual successfully crosses the aforementioned threshold, the moment of the sovereign ego's awakening arrives. This state should not be confused with an inflated ego of superiority striving for dominance. On the contrary, it is a stable ego of self-respect, founded on inner integrity. Such an ego no longer functions to please others or to demonstrate external achievements, but strives to express the authentic truth of its being. Its decisions are now made not under the influence of fear or guilt, but from deep inner alignment with its own principles. It builds relationships with others not in search of salvation or dependency, but for genuine exchange and mutual growth. This mature ego does not seek rigid certainty in everything. It is capable of embracing the mystery and uncertainty of the surrounding world. It does not need public applause or external validation. Instead, it deeply honors its own inner voice and follows it. At the core of this process lies a profound spiritual truth. Carl Gustav Jung viewed the separation from the maternal complex as a phenomenon extending far beyond purely psychological aspects. This critical moment marks an individual's departure from familiar, accustomed reality, that which is associated with the mother as an embodiment of the collective unconscious and a symbol of safety, and their entry into the unexplored, wild, yet sacred territory of the authentic self. Here, self does not merely refer to an egoistic fantasy, but a powerful inner guide, a creative force that carries the potential of our life's purpose and inspires us to realize it. Furthermore, by freeing themselves from the influence of the maternal complex, individuals do not reject love. On the contrary, they turn towards the fundamental truth of their being. Such a step allows them to transition from a life based on fulfilling others or imposed scripts to existing as an active co-creator of their own. Unique meaning, it is ritual actions that serve as a catalyst for the unfolding of this profound process. Jung was deeply aware of the necessity of clearly marking these transitional thresholds in human life. Whether through artistic creation, in-depth dream work, systematic journaling, or the performance of sacred symbolic gestures, individuals strive to give tangible form to invisible, formless inner changes. Thus, the completion of the previous stage is proclaimed, the old is over. In the depths of their consciousness, individuals address the image of the mother with the words, "I honor you, but from now on I do not belong to you. My belonging is to myself." These altars are not built from material stone, but from pure courage. They are embodied in acts of brave boundary setting, in moments of piercing honesty with oneself and the world, and in every breath taken without fear of possible punishment. Separation, therefore, is by no means an act of betrayal. On the contrary, it is the deepest devotion to life itself. Such a step represents the process of becoming a vessel whose inner space becomes vast enough to contain both the grief and unhealed wounds of the past and the enduring beauty of what is yet to come. Without this vitally important act, we are doomed to endlessly circle in the same shadows, repeating long familiar but destructive patterns. With it, however, the true path to oneself, to one's own wholeness and individuation, begins. As Carl Jung once insightfully remarked, the task of man is to become conscious of the contents that rise out of the unconscious. And it is in the labyrinth of the maternal complex that the first, decisive door to healing opens through the brave and liberating act of letting go. Moving on to the fifth point, we should focus on the psychological symptoms arising from an unhealed mother wound, particularly from the perspective of depth psychology. Carl Jung, the great explorer of the human psyche, once uttered a profound truth. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Perhaps nowhere is this principle manifested with such striking clarity as in the silent yet profoundly destructive consequences generated by an unhealed mother wound. When the maternal complex remains dormant, unexamined and unintegrated, it does not simply vanish. Instead, it begins to metastasize, permeating every corner of the human psyche, skillfully and subtly shaping fundamental beliefs, determining behavioral responses, coloring emotional states, and influencing the nature of an individual's interpersonal relationships. Jung emphasized that these manifestations are by no means accidental failures or ordinary character traits. Rather, they represent archetypal patterns, visible manifestations of unresolved energies that have not yet been brought from the shadow of the unconscious into the light of consciousness. We will now examine 9 deeply rooted psychic manifestations that serve as indicators of an unhealed mother wound. These symptoms extend far beyond the individual's personal experience, penetrating the very essence of the collective unconscious. 1. The inner critic and chronic self-doubt. One of the most prominent signs of an unhealed mother wound is a relentless inner voice that persistently whispers destructive thoughts. You're not good enough. Who are you to think that? This is not merely typical self-doubt, but rather an internalized shadow of the maternal voice. It represents a psychic echo of early childhood experiences when love might have been conditional, approval deliberately withheld, and any vulnerability punished. Masking itself as logic or morality, this voice relentlessly suppresses the ego and hinders the full expression of the self. Carl Jung described such a phenomenon as a complex, an autonomous fragment of the psyche, functioning like a parasite that feeds on the ego's attempts at growth and development. 2. Fear of autonomy and clinging to dependency. Many individuals carrying the burden of this wound find themselves torn between a strong desire for freedom and an overwhelming dread of it. They genuinely crave independence but feel paralyzed when the need to act alone arises. Decision-making seems exceptionally dangerous to them. Success is perceived as a betrayal, while failure, conversely, becomes a means of maintaining invisible loyalty to the suffering image of the mother. Jung viewed this dynamic as regression, a return to the encompassing embrace of the archetypal mother. It is a state in which security is achieved at the cost of one's own self. 3. Guilt, shame, and inherited burden. In the depths of the human psyche, there exists a profound, almost sacred sense of guilt that envelops those who strive for autonomy and separation from the encompassing maternal complex. This internal stance, like an invisible voice, whispers, "By succeeding, I am essentially betraying her. By developing and moving forward, I am leaving her behind." This phenomenon is not purely a personal experience. It is deeply archetypal. Its roots lie in the archaic primal belief about the inseparable connection between an individual's survival and the emotional well-being of the parent. The famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung interpreted this state as the child's unconscious adoption of their parent's unlived life. Thus, all the mother's unrealized desires, imposed limitations, and deep sufferings are passed on to the subsequent generation, becoming an invisible psychic inheritance. 4. Pattern of self-renunciation and people-pleasing. Individuals who have experienced wounding maternal disapproval or have only known conditional attachment often develop exceptional mastery in self-renunciation. Their ego, still subservient to the learned pleasing pattern, systematically ignores and suppresses its own true needs for the sake of maintaining the status of being good, loved, or accepted. Personal boundaries are perceived by them as potential threats, and any act of refusal or disagreement inevitably generates a deep sense of shame. Carl Gustav Jung, in turn, viewed this phenomenon as a manifestation of an ego that continues to reside in the mask of an obedient child, terrified of the potential wrath of the internally introjected maternal figure and completely unfamiliar with the sacred power of its own authentic voice. 5. Attracting relationships that replicate the wound. This often becomes one of the most agonizing aspects of human existence. People frequently find themselves drawn to those who seem to mirror the emotional landscape of their mother wound. These might be emotionally distant, overly critical, domineering, or even suffocating partners. It's important to understand that such a repetition of scenarios is not a sign of foolishness or weakness. On the contrary, it is a deep, symbolic attempt by the psyche to achieve healing. The great analyst Jung indicated that the unconscious recreates unresolved trauma in the external world, not for punishment, but to provide an opportunity for its resolution and healing. However, if the individual remains unaware of this projection, they tend to perceive the recurring pattern as an inevitable fate, mistakenly calling suffering love. The 6th point concerns the core wound of insufficiency. The belief, "I am not good enough," transforms into a constant background hum of the soul, an unspoken mandate inherited from maternal neglect, absence, or the unattainable standards she set. This deeply ingrained conviction manifests as perfectionism, excessive striving for achievement, a tormenting sense of shame, and an inability to experience true joy without internal apologies or justifications. Jung astutely recognized this phenomenon as the silent cry of the inner child, still waiting to be seen, still longing for the warmth that never quite arrived. The 7th point highlights the suppression of creative impulses and a pervasive fear of self-expression. The maternal archetype, a potent force within the human psyche, is not only a source of nourishment, but also of life-giving inception. When this foundational archetype is wounded, the very act of creation becomes fraught with peril. Individuals often find that expressing their authentic self feels profoundly unsafe. A sense of paralysis can overcome an individual who fears their unique gifts and contributions will be harshly judged, their voice stifled before it can be heard, and their inner light utterly rejected. Carl Jung, the eminent analytical psychologist, asserted that when the devouring mother archetype dominates the psyche, the individual unconsciously harbors a deep-seated fear that to shine, to fully manifest their potential, means inviting either outright rejection or, even more alarmingly, severe retribution. The 8th aspect manifests through somatic symptoms which serve as the body's urgent call for profound healing. It is well known that what the conscious mind strives to suppress, the physical body invariably finds a way to express. Jung meticulously documented how unresolved psychological complexes often manifest as tangible physical ailments. These can include persistent fatigue, debilitating anxiety, various autoimmune disorders, and complex eating issues that strikingly mirror a fundamental disconnect between acts of nourishment and assimilation. These manifestations are far from mere incidental ailments. Rather, they represent the body's symbolic language, issuing a potent plea for reconciliation between the wounded ego and the neglected, often forgotten, inner child. Finally, the 9th point delves into spiritual alienation and a profound sense of existential emptiness. At the very core of the unhealed maternal wound lies a vast void, an abyss where the vital connection to the feminine principle, the primordial Great Mother, has been irrevocably severed. Consequently, the individual may experience a deep-seated sense of spiritual orphanhood, constantly searching for something indefinable. They may relentlessly pursue external validation, strive persistently for material success, or chase fleeting moments of ecstatic pleasure, yet find that nothing truly brings lasting fulfillment or inner peace. Jung interpreted this pervasive sense of dissatisfaction as a profound hunger of the soul, yearning for a sacred reunion with the archetypal mother perceived as the lost fount of life itself, a wellspring of ancient wisdom and the ultimate source of an enduring sense of inner belonging. The concluding reflection for the fifth part of the narrative urges the reader to a profound understanding. The symptoms of the maternal wound are by no means evidence of personal failure or weakness. They represent profound messages, distinct cries of the soul, indicating the loss of something significant, something that has been ignored or buried deep within the psyche. Carl Gustav Jung, the great thinker, never advocated for blaming mothers. His teaching was directed towards reclaiming one's own projections, bravely confronting those aspects of the self that had been exiled, and reuniting with one's true essence. The healing process does not imply a complete erasure of the past. It lies in mastering the art of holding it without becoming its helpless hostage. Jung's famous dictum, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate," in the context of the maternal wound, ceases to be merely a metaphor. It transforms into a precise map, indicating the path, and this path begins not with accusation, but with profound awareness, not with rebellion, but with a return to oneself. The child who once was not seen must now transform into an adult who consciously chooses to see themselves. It is from this point that healing originates, and it is here that true freedom is born. The sixth aspect to consider is the embrace of the shadow mother, representing a ritual of inner transformation deeply rooted in the sacred framework of Jungian depth psychology. Encountering the shadow mother is not merely a therapeutic session, it is a profound soul initiation, demanding the fullness of one's presence. Jung did not consider this encounter optional for those seeking wholeness. Rather, he viewed it as a vital, foundational stage. Healing the maternal wound is not achieved solely through intellectual understanding, nor through polite forgiveness offered from a superficial ego level. It demands a courageous, raw symbolic descent into the psychic underworld, where a reckoning with the shadow of the archetypal mother takes place. It is an encounter as ancient as myth and as intimate as one's own heartbeat. In the symbolic language of alchemy, nigredo, or blackening, marks the initial stage of profound transformation. It is the metaphorical death of illusions. For the individual constrained by the mother complex, this moment signifies the dissipation of the deceptive, idealized veil of the mother image, giving way to something darker, the all-consuming aspect of archetypal femininity. Carl Jung taught that this inner darkness is not a manifestation of evil, rather, it is sacred. Within it lies the lost inner fire of the self. The shadow mother, in all her formidable essence, contains the very elements necessary for freedom, creative unfolding, and true power. She acts as the guardian of a treasure buried beneath layers of fear. The process of seeing is the first step towards integration. Individuation begins precisely when the individual dares to face this reality. A clear, undistorted perception of the shadow mother, free from idealization or denial, represents the initial act of rebellion and reclamation of one's soul. It requires immense courage to acknowledge her manipulations, her deep-seated fear of abandonment, her insatiable need to possess or control, and the ways in which she projected her own pain onto the child. As long as we cling to the fantasy of the eternally giving, endlessly sacrificing, good mother, we remain captives of a childlike state of mind, unable to step into the sacred and powerful, mature self. One inevitably confronts the profound manifestations of childhood anger and grief. Beneath outward compliance often lies suppressed rage, and beneath that rage, in turn, rests a deep, unexpressed sorrow. As the eminent psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung asserted, such emotional states should not be viewed as pathological deviations. On the contrary, they represent sacred energies, invaluable fragments of the soul that were once exiled from consciousness under the influence of overwhelming guilt and paralyzing fear. To achieve genuine healing, one must dare to acknowledge and embrace the fury born of betrayal, the agonizing pain of feeling unseen and unacknowledged, and finally, the profound sorrow over the mother's inability to provide the emotional or spiritual sustenance the child's soul so desperately needed. Such grief is not a step backward, a regression into the past. Rather, it signifies a true resurrection, a rebirth. It is through various forms of expression, be it ritualistic practices, creative self-expression in art, or even simply quiet, cleansing tears, that one creates the necessary space for these exiled parts of the soul to return and integrate. One of the most powerful tools on the path to wholeness is the method of active imagination, allowing for dialogue with the so-called shadow mother. Developed by Jung, active imagination serves as a bridge, reliably connecting the conscious mind with the autonomous, independent figures residing in the depths of the unconscious. Through this method, one enters into a vivid, direct dialogue with the image of the shadow mother, yet the aim of this interaction is not to confront or battle her, but to listen attentively to her voice, to understand her message. In the course of such communication, the shadow mother can reveal long-suppressed emotions, such as fear, jealousy, profound grief, or unmourned loss. It is through this profound conversation that the ego transforms. It ceases to be a helpless child constantly craving external approval and becomes an adult capable of listening, expressing themselves, and asserting their inner sovereignty. As a result of this process, the false, simplistic division of the world into all good or all bad categories gradually dissolves, paving the way for genuine personal wholeness. The symbolic death of maternal despotism. This profound confrontation signifies not the demise of the physical mother, but rather the demolition of the psychic prison that her image can still represent for the individual. Tormenting nightmares, tumultuous emotional upheavals, and the crumbling of seemingly unshakable beliefs often accompany this momentous symbolic transition. However, within Carl Jung's mythopoetic lens, this death acquires a sacred meaning. It mirrors the ancient myth of the hero who dares to descend into the underworld to face the dragon, the embodiment of the maternal shadow, and then ascends, reborn and transformed. What truly dies in this process is not the living person, the mother, but merely the ego's illusory perceptions. And what is born as a result is the genuine freedom of the soul, along with the reclamation of one's rejected femininity. Reclamation of the rejected feminine, the shadow mother wounds not only the heart, her impact extends deeper, traumatizing an individual's inner femininity. This pertains to qualities such as intuition, gentleness, joy, sensuality, and receptivity. When individuals experience fear of the mother image, they are, in essence, fearing these aspects within themselves. However, the process of psychological integration brings with it a reunion with these suppressed parts. Individuals begin to trust the inner knowing that was once actively silenced. They express their emotions without any shame or embarrassment. They create, feel, and love no longer as children, needing constant permission or approval, but as souls who have remembered and affirmed their inherent right to exist. Jung viewed this as one of the fundamental healings, particularly relevant in cultures that systematically suppress the feminine archetype. The process of transformation leading to liberation requires clear demarcation. The human psyche vitally needs rituals, a series of symbolic actions such as creating and then ritually burning unsent letters, creative self-expression through art, or the solemn declaration of personal sovereignty in a space imbued with special meaning, serves as a powerful signal to the unconscious, heralding the inner changes that have occurred. Carl Jung asserted that rituals act as thresholds, marking the end of the former self's existence and the birth of the individuated personality. They whisper, as it were, to the archetypal shadow mother, the symbol of past limitations. Your dominion has ended. I acknowledge your influence, but my essence no longer belongs to you. With the completion of this inner work, something truly remarkable occurs, the emergence of compassion, grounded in seeing the mother as a complete human being. The maternal image, whether an inner archetype or a real external figure, ceases to be perceived as an infallible goddess or a terrifying monster. Instead, it gains a genuine human dimension, wounded, certainly, and imperfect, yet entirely human. Jung taught that true compassion is not born out of obligation, but flows from profound understanding. This compassion, however, does not condone the harm inflicted. It frees the heart from oppressive bitterness and allows the soul to breathe fully again, liberated from the shackles of resentment and reconnected with the continuous flow of life. The concluding reflection presented here pertains to the sixth part of the narrative. Encountering the concept of the Shadow Mother symbolizes a profound immersion, a descent, as it were, into a mysterious cave where human fear and its inherent freedom inextricably coexist in close proximity to each other. Such an encounter should not be perceived as an act of aggression or violence. On the contrary, it represents the deepest act of devotion to one's inner truth, sincere loyalty to one's soul, and ultimately to the very essence of being. The eminent thinker Carl Gustav Jung designated this transformative journey with the term individuation, emphasizing its pivotal role in the process of becoming a whole, integrated self. This challenging path originates in a painful rupture with old patterns, traverses through the depths of grief and experience, and ultimately culminates in a complete rebirth, the attainment of a new form of existence. As Jung himself wisely observed, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. However, it is precisely beyond the veil of this inevitable pain that must be overcome that true freedom lies. This is the freedom to live not in constant reaction to past traumatic experiences, but in conscious service to one's true essence. It is the freedom to love not from a sense of lack or deficiency, but from a state of inner fullness and abundance. And finally, it is the freedom to complete one's earthly journey, not as someone's dependent child, but as an absolutely sovereign, self-sufficient soul. The eighth important aspect is as follows. Forgiveness itself is not the ultimate goal. The true goal one strives for is the attainment of comprehensive freedom. In the sacred, deeply symbolic language of Jungian psychology, forgiveness is not regarded as the crown or culmination of healing. Rather, it appears as a shadow that may only quietly and subtly follow the far more potent and profound light of genuine inner transformation. Carl Jung, the distinguished founder of analytical psychology, consciously did not place forgiveness at the epicenter of the individuation process. He was well aware that no true, genuine healing can be initiated or conditioned by external moral obligations, imposed norms, or societal notions of proper conduct. Instead, his teaching indicated that the authentic path to healing begins with a much more complex and sometimes painful process, a deep inner descent into the most hidden corners of the psyche. This descent is necessary to confront, without the slightest hesitation, boldly and openly, the full, undeniable reality of the wound received. This is especially pertinent when this deep wound was inflicted or carved by the very hands that, by their nature, should have provided support, protection, and care. When it came to forgiveness, Carl Jung emphatically stressed that this feeling should by no means be artificial or contrived. It is neither a public ceremony intended for external eyes, nor a display of one's spiritual superiority. On the contrary, Jung saw forgiveness as the quiet, non-violent outcome of the soul's deep return to itself. It is the very moment when an individual reclaims their inner psychic authority and no longer feels the need for external permissions to feel whole and complete. Thus, forgiveness, if it truly arises, is merely a byproduct of inner integration, not a prerequisite or preliminary step for achieving true liberation. Jung warned that premature forgiveness often turns into a kind of psychological bypass, serving as a sedative offered in place of the genuine inner fire that requires processing. Society, particularly through the lens of spiritual and religious doctrines, often instills the belief that forgiveness is tantamount to virtue. However, when forgiveness is offered too hastily, when it is dictated by guilt, religious obligation, or the fear of being perceived as unhealed, it becomes another mask, concealing unacknowledged and unexpressed anger, grief, and a sense of betrayal. In such a form, forgiveness serves the so-called mother complex, and this is no longer liberation, but on the contrary, a profound suppression of true emotions. Before genuine healing can firmly take root, attention must be given to deeper, unprocessed aspects of being. This concerns the voice that was suppressed, the anger that was shamed, the grief that remained unaccepted, and the inner child who waited patiently but was never seen. Carl Jung asserted that the recognition of these fundamental truths is not a regression, but represents a genuine revolution. The individual must allow themselves to mourn the mother they never had, to express rage against the control that stifled their development, and to grieve for the years sacrificed to illusory loyalty. It is crucial to understand that this is not an attack on the mother figure, but a vital act of liberating one's own soul. Genuine healing begins the moment the image of the maternal figure ceases to be frozen in myth, no longer perceived as either an angel or a monster. Instead, she appears clearly visible as she was and is, an imperfect, wounded human being. This act of humanization shatters the projections that once inflated her power and dismantles the psychic structures that held the self captive. In this space of clarity, after the experienced storm and rupture, the possibility for forgiveness may finally emerge. However, even then, this forgiveness must stem not from a sense of obligation, but solely from the deep-rootedness of a sovereign heart. However, even in the absence of certain conditions, freedom remains entirely attainable. This profound understanding serves as a cornerstone. Carl Jung, for instance, firmly asserted that liberation by no means requires an act of forgiveness. On the contrary, the key condition is integration. The individual is called to unite the disparate elements of their psyche, be it a long-suppressed voice, repressed feelings, accumulated anger, or forgotten gentleness, and return them to the realm of conscious being. They must establish clear boundaries, not with the aim of punishing anyone, such as the mother, but to restore the inner landscape that was once under the influence of her image. The true goal here is not reconciliation with the external world, but profound individuation. As one progresses along this path, inherited patterns of guilt and identification gradually begin to lose their power. As a concluding reflection pertaining to the eighth part, it should be noted, in Jungian psychology, forgiveness is not viewed as the ultimate goal or finish line. It is rather a natural fruit, like a leaf that may fall from a tree when the roots of the inner self are deeply embedded in the soil of being. The true path of human development lies not in striving for external reconciliation, but in restoring one's own inner authority and autonomy. This is a process that can be called a quiet, yet profound, revolution. Its essence lies in the individual no longer adapting their truth or authentic self-expression to earn anyone's love. They cease to silence their instincts and inner impulses for the sake of maintaining a semblance of connection, and finally they no longer shrink or diminish themselves, trying to maintain an illusion of peace and harmony around them. The renowned Swiss thinker Carl Jung asserted, "Only the man who can consciously assent to the power of the shadow within himself can overcome it." In the context of the deep analysis of the mother complex, this profound insight means that the individual ceases to passively await external forgiveness or permission for their liberation. On the contrary, it calls for active engagement, for the decisive reclamation of one's own power, for the volitional choice to liberate oneself. This act of emancipation is not postponed until safer or more favorable conditions arise, but is undertaken here and now in the present moment. The narrative presented hereafter concerns the final stage of this journey, rebirth, transcending the influence of the mother complex. Within Jungian depth psychology, the process of healing the maternal wound is not an end point or the culmination of suffering. It is rather a sacred transition, a liminal state leading into an entirely new phase of existence. It symbolizes not merely relief from pain or its resolution, but the genuine metaphorical death of the self that was shaped by survival strategies, forced silence, and inherited grief. It is in this symbolic demise that rebirth begins. This is the new birth of an individual who is no longer bound by ancestral roles or unseen but strong attachments, but who asserts their authentic sovereignty, relying on the true essence of their self. Jung taught that only through conscious confrontation, profound mourning, and subsequent inner integration of the mother complex can an individual take their first genuine steps towards achieving psychological wholeness. This transformation extends far beyond ordinary healing. It represents a genuine metamorphosis of the soul, a complete dissolution of the false self. As the grip of the mother complex loosens, the internal ego framework, meticulously constructed on principles of people-pleasing, striving for perfection, and maintaining an established family myth, gradually begins to crumble. Jung warned that this unraveling of self-identity often manifests as a profound crisis, an identity collapse, where former values suddenly seem empty, life's direction is lost, and the inner center ceases to hold balance. However, this sacred disorientation, this state of profound uncertainty, Jung likened to nigredo, the blackening phase in the alchemical journey. It is a stage where the old must completely dissolve and break down to make way for the uncovering of the hidden, true gold of the soul. In the resulting inner void, something much deeper emerges. The ascent of the sovereign self occurs. The essence rising from the depths of this psychic underworld is not a person regressed to childhood, but a fully formed adult, born anew. No longer focused on the imagined gaze of the maternal figure, this self is guided not by guilt or poignant longing, but by a deep inner congruence with its own principles. Such a reborn individual no longer seeks external salvation or approval. They become a parent to themselves, a source of their own support. They choose authentic presence over people-pleasing, and their path begins not with timid apologies, but with the manifestation of quiet yet undeniable authority. Carl Gustav Jung aptly characterized this process as the awakening of the sovereign, the self that comes to life from its own unique center, thereby rewriting its inner myth. The transformation of personal identity inevitably entails the need to unravel and revise the inherited life script. The former behavioral narrative, comprising assertions like, "I must sacrifice myself to gain worth," "I am never good enough until I earn recognition," must be decisively released from the depths of the psyche. In its place, an entirely different, renewed myth emerges. This new myth is not created as a reaction to maternal pain or expectations. Rather, it is forged in deep reverence for one's own authentic truth. The great thinker Carl Gustav Jung viewed this internal re-evaluation as an inherent sacred right of every individual, allowing them to transcend family tragedy and independently become the full author of their new, symbolic life. These are the sacred frontiers of individuation. With this emergence comes an urgent need for boundary setting. Their purpose is not punishment, but robust protection. Interaction with the external mother, if her presence is still felt, must be conducted with utmost clarity. The internal mother, whose voice often expresses shame, fear, or guilt, requires recognition and a subsequent gentle disempowerment. Jung tirelessly emphasized that boundaries are not ruptures in love, but rather affirmations of selfhood. These are invisible psychic lines intended to safeguard the adult from regression and to honor the hard-won territory of the self. The return of the internal mother marks a profound shift as the need for external nourishment gradually recedes, becoming rooted within. Here, the archetypal internal mother re-emerges not as a judging voice, but as a gentle whisper of intuition, tenderness, and care. Self-nurturing transforms into a living ritual. Rest acquires sacred significance. Emotions are honored without apology. Jung understood this as the reintegration of the feminine principle, where being is no longer perceived as weakness, but manifests as wisdom in motion. The emergence of a new phase of creative being occurs as the human soul, liberated from the subconscious dominance of the maternal image, regains its capacity to flourish. The previously dormant creative energy, long constrained by the fear of rejection, gradually stirs into motion. Its manifestations can take various forms, expressed through words, embodied in visual images, felt through touch, or revealed in dynamic actions. Carl Gustav Jung regarded such a creative resurgence not as mere external adornment or a secondary aspect, but as undeniable evidence of the deep rooting of the individuation process. For true creativity signifies the assertion of one's own authorship in one's life. It is an action stemming not from past pain or damage, but from a state of genuine wonder and awe. The individual's return to the world in a state of wholeness is central. Jung asserted that the process of individuation is never egocentric. On the contrary, it prepares the individual for a harmonious return to the social collective, not as a traumatized child seeking healing and support from others, but as a mature individual capable of offering their presence, sharing wisdom, and expressing genuine love. Interpersonal relationships undergo a profound transformation. They cease to be mere repetitions of past losses or unfulfilled expectations, evolving into full vessels of mutuality and exchange. The goal of interaction becomes not the search for external approval, but the desire to contribute one's own unique essence. Such a mature self, confidently taking its place in the world without any sense of shame, is capable of breaking negative family or collective curses for future generations. One of perhaps the most astonishing and profound ideas proposed by Jung is the understanding of healing the so-called maternal wound as an act with transgenerational consequences. When an individual dares to confront this wound and integrate it into their psyche, they effectively interrupt an established ancestral pattern. Thus, the pain once experienced by the mother ceases to be unconsciously transmitted to subsequent generations. Instead of attempting to save their mother, the healed individual transforms into a conscious ancestor, one who returns to the origins of their lineage, not to change the past of their parents, but to redeem their entire lineage. This is truly a deeper and more significant offering, to become the one capable of finally lifting an ancient curse, thereby generating an entirely new legacy filled with wholeness, creativity, and authentic freedom. In conclusion, it is worth offering one more reflection. The concept of rebirth in Jungian psychology does not imply a simple return to the state one was in before experiencing pain. On the contrary, it signifies an awakening to the awareness of one's true destiny, of who the individual was always meant to become. It is a quiet yet powerful rebellion against inherited guilt, unconscious attachments, and the pervasive family shadow that can obscure existence. It is truly a radical act, allowing one to take the pen back into one's own hands to write one's story. As Jung so profoundly and powerfully stated, your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. And once the maternal wound is healed, this awakening acquires the deepest meaning. No one else will come to rewrite one's personal history, because now one is its full author, and the page before them is utterly blank and ready for new chapters.